Okay, hi guys. Thanks for coming. So in case you don't know, I'm Alex and I'm Ecosoc's invert rep. And yeah, I'm gonna just talk about rock pools for a bit. Also, first thing, apologies that this talk kind of ended up overlapping with low tide at Gilly, which has kind of messed with the scavenger hunt a bit. This talk was supposed to be at 3, and then your timetables got released and everything got a bit screwed up. But anyway, yeah, I will. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. See my screen there. Okay, so I guess first things first, just in case you're skeptical or you've never done it before, why do it? So the marine environment is amazing, as I'm assuming pretty much everyone knows. If you've ever seen Blue Planet or whatever, anything like that. But the problem is that it's, by and large, it's really inaccessible. But the intertidal zone where the rock pools are is the only part that can really be accessed really easily and for free. It takes a whole bunch of money to go do whale watching trips or learn to scuba dive or something like that, but not so for the rock pools. And I just love it because you just never know what you're going to get down there. So, for example, like the first time I got back here in the beginning of September, I found one of these little guys for the first time. I've never seen one before. This is a little baby top knot, a type of flatfish. That's totally new to me. And I'm always going down and finding something completely weird and bizarre that I've never seen before. So, yeah, I highly recommend it. The first thing to know to get the most out of rock pooling is to know all about the tides. They're not at a set time of day, so they'll change day by day, and the height varies throughout the months and also throughout the year. You have very high tides and low tides, and then very low tides. So generally, you want to try and time it so you can get out onto the shore when it's at low tide, because there's a larger diversity of species that you can find. The higher shore is kind of home to a smaller number of specialists, which are also cool, but if you want to see a lot of species, it's the lower the tide, the better. And so what you want to know about are the spring tides, which is when the sun and the moon are aligned. So you have the greatest gravitational pull, and that will create the largest tidal range. So you'll have really high tides followed by really low tides that will expose a huge amount of the shoreline. Neap tides, on the other hand, are when the sun and the moon are pulling in opposite directions. So you get a very small tidal range. Those days are not so good for rock pooling. Still always worth going down because you never know what you'll see, but just generally as a rule, it works a bit less well. And you can find the times online by doing a bit of digging on Google. I use an app called My Tide Times, which works really well, although it's free and it only gives you 7 days worth of forecasts. So I think you've got to pay money to get a version that goes way into the future if you want to do planning ahead. So I guess there's a bit of a code of conduct to follow. So one really important thing is to return any rocks and seaweed as you found them. It's really important for a lot of the animals to provide protection from predators and the elements. If you leave them exposed, they could dry out and desiccate quite quickly, or more likely they'll just get picked off by seagulls. Yeah, do that. But it's also really important not to, you've got to be really gentle when you're putting rocks down, not to sort of just drop them down on any sort of unfortunate animal that might be underneath. I have done that with a crab once. It was very sad. I don't recommend it. Try not to stand on seaweed as much as possible. It can be pretty hard sometimes, but you never know what might be hanging out underneath it. And so, yeah, that's best to stand on sort of bits of rock if you can see them. Don't get too enthusiastic with collecting stuff and start pulling anything off the rocks. Anything that's attached itself is probably a goner if you've ripped it off. So yeah, that's bad. And also, if you're collecting animals to have a look at, it's quite important to put them back where you found them. A lot of rockpool creatures don't particularly care if they end up in the same rock pool or not. But for some, it's really important. So, for instance, there's a few fish which are really territorial. And so one particular rock pool will be that fish's territory. Or it might be guarding eggs and in that particular rock pool. And there's even a few that potentially mate for life. So if you sort of pick it out and put it in a different rock pool from its mate, there's the possibility that you might have caused a lot of heartbreak for some poor little fish. So yeah, try and return things to the exact place you found them. And another thing that's really important is if you go down to the shore with a bucket or a tray to put things in, don't just keep filling it up with loads and loads of animals. It's that kind of classic thing you see kids doing when they go rock pooling on holiday, where they sort of walk along the shoreline, filling up this bucket with more and more creatures. The first thing is that a lot of them really, a lot of them are fine, don't bother each other. Some, especially some of the crabs and fish, will sort of tear each other to pieces, either because they're territorial and they hate their own species, or because they see everything else that you've put in the bucket as food. So you can create a bit of carnage doing that. Also, if you fill a small amount of water with a load of animals that are all trying to breathe oxygen from it, that water can quickly become deoxygenated, and you'll end up with a container full of suffocating animals. Especially if it's on a warm day, that bucket can get really quite hot quite quickly. So yeah, be mindful about how long you're sort of taking animals out of their environment for, and who you're mixing them with. It would be very irresponsible of me not to mention safety, at least briefly, because for one thing, if you've been on the shore for any amount of time, you know it can be really, really slippery, and it's full of sharp rocks, and those things don't always mix. You can have some nasty accidents, potentially. So definitely wear good footwear with decent grip. So Wellingtons, wetsuit boots, and old trainers work really well for that. Things like flip-flops and sandals are a very silly thing to wear. Probably the best sort of way to have an accident, I guess. And just keep in the back of your mind about the incoming tide, because it can really catch you off guard sometimes, especially on some coasts more than others, depending on the sort of topography. But yeah, if it catches you off guard, you can end up sort of cut off quite far out potentially, or wash any kit away that you've left lying around. So yeah, that's definitely not advised. One really, really cool aspect of rock pooling is nighttime rock pooling, which is great because there's a lot of rock pool animals which are very nocturnal, and they'll do their best to hide from you in the day. But if you go down at night with a good light, you can just find them hanging out in the middle of the rock pools, bold as brass, just going about their business or displaying a lot more behavior than you'd see in the day. For instance, you can see the crabs are just sort of, they can just be running around, coming out of the rock pools, sort of foraging around because there's no birds to have a go at them. A lot of fish you'll see much more easily at night. And there's some animals, especially some of the anemones, which will fluoresce under UV, and it just looks really spectacular. So if you can get down with a UV torch or some kind of UV light, you're in for a treat. But it has to be said, it is all the things that make rock that could be seen as hazards for rock pooling in the day are sort of a lot more potentially a lot more dangerous at night. So any chance of sort of slipping is greater. You can get lost or cut off by a tide much more easily. So definitely check the tide times before you go out. And it's probably sensible only to do it on a beach that you're familiar with, so that you already could know the layout from going there in the day. So you kind of know your exit plan if you need. And it's really a good idea not to do it alone, because if you have an accident and you're out alone on a dark shoreline with no one around and no lights anywhere, especially if your mobiles and you got wet or whatever, then that could potentially be quite bad. And if you can tell someone that you're going, so much the better, so that if you never turn up in the morning, they kind of have some idea of what might have happened. So first, I guess this is just going to be a bit of a kind of brief introduction to some of the cool little creatures that you can find there. There's just so much that you can find out in the rock pools that it would be completely impossible to cover even a fraction of it really in one talk. So I've just sort of picked a few creatures that are either really common or really visible, or a few that I think are just really cool, that are rarer, but worth mentioning just because I like them a lot, and you should know about them too. I should confess, if you really love seaweeds or worms, I've failed you completely because I haven't included any of them. I don't really know seaweeds well enough, and worms are kind of, it's very hard to distinguish a lot of them, so it would be kind of a bit of a rabbit hole to go down, sort of mentioning them all. Okay, so to start with, there's the beadlet anemone. This is probably the one that you're most likely to see if you go down to any kind of rocky coast. They're the most common. They're also found a lot higher up the shore than any of the other anemones because they're a lot more tolerant to being completely exposed for longer amounts of time, which is what happens higher up the shore. They're able to completely retract their tentacles inside their outer body to avoid desiccation. So yeah, they're a lot more well adapted to surviving being exposed. They come in a range of colours. Most of the ones you'll see are probably going to be red, but they can also be sort of brown or green. And the thing that gives them the name, the beadlet anemone, is this ring of bright blue beads that you can only really see when they're fully exposed, when the tentacles are fully exposed in the water. And these are called acaragi, apparently. And they contain a much more high density of the stinging cells than the normal feeding tentacles. And rather than using them to catch prey, they'll use them to fight off other beadlet anemones because they're quite territorial. So if another beadlet anemone gets too close, they'll slowly sort of wallop each other with these beads, and eventually, it can take several days, but eventually one of them will sort of get bored of being stung constantly and move on. Then there's the strawberry anemone, which can get quite a bit bigger than the beadlet anemone, and it's pretty easy to tell apart because the strawberry anemone has all these small green spots on the body that look like strawberry seeds, and it's found further down the shore than the beadlet. It can't retract its tentacles fully like the beadlet, so you can see in this picture it's trying its best, but there's still some of its tentacles are exposed, so it's more at risk of drying out. And it also has these same acaragi, but they're a lot less distinctive. And then there's the snake blocks anemone, which is a really stunning creature. It has really big, long tentacles, hence the name. Sometimes they're so big that the the brown body is completely obscured by them. And it comes in two color variants. There's one which is sort of vivid green with purple tips, and then one which is more of a sort of brown grey. And the cool thing about them is that they, as well as killing and eating all sorts of creatures that come too close, they have symbiotic algae inside their tentacles called zooxanthellae, which produce food by photosynthesis. And it's the same process that a lot of the reef-forming corals have in the tropics. So like those kind of corals, they require shallow sunlit seas to live in, so they're quite a sort of coastal specialist. Okay, onto the crabs, everyone's favourite. So for the classic crab, if you've ever kind of had a holiday by the coast and been crabbing or looking for crabs, this is probably the one that you've encountered the most, is the shore crab. Interestingly, isn't actually the commonest at Gili I found, but generally it is by far and away the commonest. So the kind of classic distinguishing features to look for are these, either side of the eyes it has on the carapace these 5 teeth, and then in between the eyes it has, if you look closely, it has 3 small equal-sized lobes, and that's how you can tell for sure that it's a shore crab. The adults are generally sort of greeny brown, but when they're young they can have a huge variety of colours and patterns, which they use mainly for camouflage. So rather than colour, it's the shape of the shell that's the best thing to look for if you want to ID them. And they're really tough as nails, adaptable crab. They can tolerate a huge temperature range. I think they can survive water which is only barely salty, up in sort of estuaries, all the way to, like, I think sort of concentrated salt water that's saltier than seawater if you put them in it. Huge range of temperatures, close to freezing, up to, I think, high 20s definitely. And because of this adaptability, they're actually considered one of the world's 100 worst invasive species outside of their native range. So in places like the west coast of the Americas, Australia, and South Africa, they're a massive pest, and they cause billions of damage to fisheries every year. So yeah, that's the shore crab. One of my absolute favourite rockpool creatures is the velvet swimming crab, yeah, they're pretty unmistakable. They have these bright red eyes, and if you look closely at the legs they have and the claws, they have sort of bluey purple markings on them. They also have the back legs that are very flattened, which allows them to swim, hence the name. And also their carapace has a sort of velvety sort of fuzz on it, so you can see why they get their name. But they're also called devil crabs. And it's not just because of the red eyes, it's because they are just absolute, just total feisty, belligerent, aggressive creatures. I think they're fantastic, but if you try and pick one up, unlike most rockpool creatures, which will just try their hardest to get away from you, these things will just rear up and go for your hand if you let them. They'll pick a fight with anything, really. I think they're fantastic, but it could be quite a painful experience if you see a big one and really feel the need to try and get a close look at it, pick it up. So you have been warned. So then there's the brown or the edible crab, which is the one that you see if you go into a fishmonger's. It isn't actually any more edible than any other crab, it's just the big one that people like to eat. And it's really easy to, has this big wide kind of oval carapace, and the edges have this kind of crimping like a pie crust or a pasty. And generally, if you find it, it will it'll just play dead. But if you find a big one, its claws could definitely do some damage to your fingers. It's quite unlikely, though. I say that the carapace can get to 25 centimeters wide, but that's really exceptional. It would be an amazing find to see one that big on a rock in the rock pools. I think the legal catch size is sort of 14 centimeters, so anything bigger than that usually gets taken in crab pots and whatnot. Then there's the fire crab, which is really common at Gilly Beach. I find them every time I go. But and they're found in Cornwall, but they quickly get quite rare sort of as you move along the coast of Dorset and then to the rest of the UK. Apparently they're a climate change indicator species, so they really like the mild climate down in Cornwall, and as they spread further around the sort of south coast of the UK, it's an indication of warming seas. They have this really distinctive carapace, which has this kind of sculptured appearance with these deep grooves. And compared to a lot of crabs, they have proportionately really large claws. They're really, really strong for their size, and so they'll if you try and pick them up and they're in a crevice, they can just sort of lock all their limbs together and wedge themselves in, and then it's really hard to pull them out. So yeah, then we've got the hermit crabs, which are absolutely fantastic. So the common hermit crab is the one you'll probably be finding 99% of the time. And this is potentially the biggest hermit crab you can find in the UK. And you can tell it's one of the identifying features is that the right claw is a lot larger than the left claw. It'll use a huge range of seashells, anything it can find that fits. And although they hide when they're disturbed, the best way I've found to observe them is if you have like a white tray or something, or a bucket or whatever, and you gather a load of them up, and then you pop them in and stay still and just sort of have a look at them. They'll quickly come back out of their shells, and if you just sort of leave them to go about their business, you can often see them. They'll sort of size up each other and either sort of, if they want a new shell that fits better, they'll either sort of arrange a swap, or more likely one of them will just sort of find the smaller one and bully it out of its shell if it wants that one, which is very entertaining to watch. Then there's the St. Piran's crab, which is a really cool creature. One of the things that I put on this talk that I haven't actually seen myself, I'm still looking for them, but apparently people seem to be seeing them more and more often around here. It's a smaller species, and compared to the common hermit crab, it has equal-sized claws that have black tips on them, red eye stalks, and the tips of the legs are red, and the eyes themselves are black with white spots. So it's got quite a few identifying features if you look closely. So definitely keep an eye out for them if you're looking for hermit crabs. And this is another species which is only really found in the southwest, particularly Devon and Cornwall. Actually, I don't know about Devon. I think definitely Cornwall, but usually Devon sort of follows Cornwall with these sorts of things. Apparently it disappeared after, or sort of around the time of the Torrey Canyon oil spill, which was a big oil tanker disaster that happened in 1967 down in Cornwall, and it disappeared after then. And I don't know if it's entirely certain that it was completely the fault of that, or whether there were some other factors as well, but it stopped being recorded. No one saw it for several decades until 2016, when it turned up again. And there was a competition, I think it was with Springwatch, I can't entirely remember, to give it a name, and it got given the name of the St. Piran's crab. St. Piran was a Cornish hermit who survived being thrown into the sea tied to a millstone. And I think there was also some sort of talk about the fact that its eyes were the colour of the Cornish flag, black and white. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for that one. I certainly would be. And it's good to know when, if you're looking for crabs, that you can sex them really easily by looking on the underside. So the abdomen of the crabs, they tuck, it's tucked underneath the body. If you imagine this would be the part on a lobster that would be sort of the back end, but with crabs it's curled underneath. And with males it's really thin and pointed and triangular. And with females it's very wide and broad, which allows them to carry eggs, as you can see in this picture here. So yeah, sexing crabs is really easy once you start looking. Then there's the broad-clawed porcelain crab. These little guys are pretty small. They have these really big, wide claws, hence the name. They have a very flattened body, and they're covered in loads of these fine hairs that trap silt and give them a quite a sort of camouflaged appearance. You can find large numbers of them under rocks, sort of quite low down on the shore. And unlike all the other crabs I've mentioned, these are filter feeders, so they have mouth parts with a sort of system of hairs that sieve particles out of the water. And yeah, they're not actually true crabs. They have they're more closely related to the lobsters. So they have these long antennae that sort of give the game away there, because all the crabs have really short antennae. And the common squat lobster is again not a crab. Has a generally quite sort of dark olive green appearance, and these really long claws and only 3 pairs of legs. Unlike crabs, which have, I think it was, oh no, I can't remember if it was 4 or 5 pairs of legs. I don't. And if you pick them up, or if you disturb them, they'll try and frantically escape by flapping their tail really quickly to sort of propel them away. And this works really great underwater. They can zoom away in seconds. But if you catch them on dry land, they'll still try the same trick. And it's very funny to watch them just sort of desperately whizzing away with their tail in dry land, not going anywhere. But they're really lovely little creatures. The common prawn is probably one of the sort of creatures you're guaranteed to see every time you go looking in a rock pool. They're just everywhere. And they have this very transparent body with all these dark stripes on them, and then sort of some sort of yellow and brown banding on the legs, on the limbs. There's actually several sort of more obscure species which are really similar, but not as common. And so you're probably most likely to be looking at the common prawn if you find something like this. But there are some others. It's just that the way that you sort of differentiate them is really quite sort of technical. You've got to sort of look at the rostrum, the pointed nose on the front of it, and sort of count small spines and look at the shape of it. And it gets sort of, it's a bit of a rabbit hole to describe all the different differences between the species. So I'm not going to do that. And then there's the brown shrimp, which is also really common, but it takes a lot more finding because it's a bit of a master of camouflage. It has this really flattened body, and it often likes to just completely bury itself in the sand. So you need to look in rock pools that have a good amount of sand at the bottom of them to find them, because they won't be sort of found in rock pools that are just rock. And they can actually change their colour to match the substrate. So yeah, they're a really cool little creature, but takes a bit more finding. And another shrimp, or it's a prawn that is a master of camouflage, is the chameleon prawn. And these guys, they come in a huge range of colours. And they can change their colour to suit their background, but some of the colours they come in, like the green and the pink ones especially, can be really really pretty little animals. And they're absolutely everywhere once you kind of get your eye in, and sort of know what to look for. But at the same time, they're really, really easy to miss. It's kind of their whole thing, their whole existence revolves around making it quite hard to spot them. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for these guys. So then we've got the grey sea slug, which is a really cool creature. They can cut, although they're called the grey sea slug, they come in. They can sort of come in a range of colours, sort of greys, browns, and pinks. And there's a few other sort of rarer sea slugs that you could potentially confuse it with. But the grey sea slug has this kind of a bit of a white V shape on the face that is the sort of distinguishing feature. And it's a predator of anemones. All the anemones I've mentioned, plus a load more, are on the menu for this guy. And what it does is it will actually take all the stinging cells of the anemones that it eats, and it puts them in these serrata, these tentacles all over its back, and uses them for its own defense. So that's quite a nifty trick if you can pull that one off. Then there's the sea hare, which is also a sea slug, but a much gentler beast, and a lot bigger. They can potentially get up to 20 centimeters, although I've never seen one that big. And this is a vegetarian, so it eats seaweed. And depending on what type it's been eating, it can be sort of various shades of green, dark red, or brown. It gets the name the sea hare from this pair of tentacles called rhinophores on its head, which supposedly look a bit like hare's ears. And it also has sort of large folds of skin on the back, which sort of apparently it has a shell underneath those that is sort of hidden away underneath these flaps, and it can contract into a sort of gelatinous blob of jelly when it's not really doing anything. So in that state, it can definitely be easy to overlook. I've never really found many of them, but apparently they can get really common at certain times of year. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for that. Then we've got the dog whelk, which looks like a pretty standard snail, but this is nightmare fuel for a lot of the slower creatures in the rock pools. It has this sort of spiral shell, which is quite pointed at the end. The best way, if in doubt, the best way to identify them is to look on the underside. And they have this groove at the front by the opening of the shell, which they pass their feeding organs through. And they come in a huge range of colours, as you can see from this picture. All of these are dog whelks. You've got all sorts of greys, creams, olives, yellows, things like that. And some of them are plain, some of them are banded. And these guys are predators. They feast on things like mussels, limpets, barnacles, and anything else that isn't quick enough to get away from them. You can actually see in this picture here, they've clearly been sort of going through these barnacles here. You can see all the ones that have been hollowed out. And it's a really gruesome process. They will drill a hole through the victim's shell, and they do that using their a toothed tongue called a radula, as well as sort of they will use a load of corrosive chemicals to get the job done. And then once they've made a hole in the shell, they'll fill it with all the digestive enzymes and dissolve the creature inside its shell, and then suck up the goo and digest it. And the whole process can take up to 4 days, which is a pretty protracted affair for the unlucky victim. So yeah, that's the dog whelk. A little bit more gentle mollusks here. The blue-red limpet is just a really stunning little creature. They can get up to 2 centimeters, but the color sort of seems to fade a bit with age. So generally the smaller ones are the most vivid. They're absolutely everywhere once you notice them, but they're really easy to overlook because they are tiny. And you find them on kelp, which is, if you don't know, is the sort of very thick, large brown seaweed that you find sort of further down the shore. So yeah, stunning animals, definitely look out for them. And then there's the common limpet, which is absolutely ubiquitous. You see them every time you go to any rocky shore anywhere. And so they're very slow moving and they don't really move about, especially if you're around. So it's really easy to overlook them and ignore them, but they're actually very impressive animals once you sort of know a few things about them. So their teeth are made of, I don't even know how to pronounce this, goethite, I think. But that was a couple of years back, that was discovered to be the strongest known biological material. I think it beat some of the active chemicals in spider silk that was originally supposed to be the strongest known material, but these guys beat them. And they use that to rasp algae and seaweed off of rocks. They can create a home scar for themselves, which is like a little limpet-shaped groove in the rock that they can snugly fit into to make themselves more secure. And they can do that just by grinding their shell into the rock. And some of these home scars can be pretty deep, and it's pretty impressive that this little mollusk can grind a hole in solid rock just by its own sort of that it's strong enough to do that. It's pretty impressive. They're also a really essential species for maintaining diversity of species on rocky shores. So they control the growth of a lot of algae and seaweeds, prevent a lot of them from sort of dominating. So they're really important for creating a varied habitat for other animals. And they can live as long as 16 years. So you can sometimes find really massive ones that are completely sort of covered in all sorts of algae and barnacles themselves. And yeah, they can be really old. So yeah, definitely next time you see them, sort of spare a thought for them. Although I know I often still overlook them and search for more exciting creatures. So the common starfish is definitely an unmistakable thing. It's a big orange starfish, sometimes small if it's a little one, but definitely orange. And it's sort of got this coating of white spines all over it. And it's called the common starfish, but it's definitely not the commonest starfish that you'll probably find rockpooling, definitely in my experience. I think it's the commonest in UK waters, but a lot of the time that's further out, sort of beyond the range of rockpoolers. I've found this one here, the spiny starfish, far more often than common starfish. These things can potentially grow absolutely massive, so 60 centimeters across, size of a dustbin lid. They've got this sort of grey-green, whitish color. Sometimes it can be quite bluey as well, with these very pretty sort of, you can't really see in the picture, but the tips of the arms are sort of very pretty purple color. And they have these sort of very distinctive rows of spines all over them. So yeah, that's a really impressive creature if you find a big one. I've never found one at 60 centimeters, but still you can find some absolute whoppers. And then at the other end of the size scale, you can find the cushion stars, which only get about a 5 centimeter diameter at the most. And they have these really stubby little chunky arms. And they come in sort of pretty variable colors, but generally it's browns, grays, olives, sort of sometimes a bit of a bluey green. Pretty cute by starfish standards, I think. And then we've got common brittle stars, which are close relatives of starfish, but starfish are pretty sort of vicious predators of other sort of animals like mussels and snails and whatnot. The brittle stars are a detritivore, so they just sort of feed on bits of debris and stuff. And they're extremely variable in their coloration. They come in just an absolutely huge range of different colors. You can get ones that are, the central disc can be red, yellow, black, brown, occasionally a bit of a sort of purple color, as you can see in this picture. Sometimes the arms are plain, sometimes they're banded. So yeah, definitely sort of keep an eye out for all the cool colors that they can come in. They're also really fast moving compared to starfish. So starfish move pretty slowly on the tube feet on their undersides, whereas the common brittle stars just sort of crawl around, flailing their arms around. And you can find lots of them cling to the undersides of rocks, sort of quite far down the shore. And yeah, if you pick up a rock, they'll all sort of go scurrying away pretty quickly to get back into the dark. And they're called brittle stars because they are quite brittle, so try to be careful with them when you do pick them up. Although all of the starfish and the brittle stars have really impressive powers of regeneration. They can grow lost limbs really easily, but nonetheless, I guess try to save them the hassle. Then there's the star obsidian, is a type of sea squirt, and sea squirts are really weird animals. I don't honestly know a whole lot about them, but although they're very simple animals, they're really closely related to vertebrates. Invertebrates that are the most closely related to vertebrates like us. And they're a colonial animal, so each of these little sort of flower or star shapes is a group of them, and then each sort of petal, so to speak, within the flower is an individual animal. And they can be really pretty animals, groups of animals. They come in a pretty wide range of colours. Some can be sort of quite nice yellows or blues, or even it's quite a fetching purple sometimes. So yeah, keep an eye out for those. Now we're on to the fish. Everyone's always asking me, what's that fish? I don't understand fish, so here we go. Here's some fish. So the shani, otherwise known as the common blenny, is probably the sort of most likely fish that you'll ever see when you go rock pooling, and it's quite a sort of specialist of the sort of higher up the shore compared to a lot of fish. It's got, I guess, the sort of defining features are this sort of quite wedge-shaped head and these big bulbous eyes which are set quite high up on the head, and it's also got quite thick lips. The smaller individuals you can see in sort of really high abundance in some rock pools, just absolutely everywhere. The bigger ones are also still very common, but it takes a bit more work to find them because they're quite territorial. So they'll have, when they're big, they'll have found a nice crevice somewhere that they'll sort of guard and live in and keep out of trouble by staying in. If you ever go up to a rock pool, you'll probably see them all bolting for cover. They're easily spooked, but if you just sit still and watch, ideally on a nice sunny day like we're not having today, but if you sit and watch patiently, they'll all sort of come out, and it's very entertaining to just watch them sort of go about their business. They'll often sort of pick fights with each other and argue and quarrel and just patrol their rock pools and graze and look for things to eat. So yeah, they're a very sort of characterful fish. And like I said, they're sort of quite specialist at living quite high up the shoreline, because they can actually survive out of water for several hours. They can do that because they have no scales on their skin, and so they can just breathe straight through their skin for several hours, so long as they're somewhere that is protected from the sun and the wind, so they don't dry out. There's a couple of other blennies to look out for, which are rarer, but worth keeping an eye out for. There's the Montague's blenny, which again is a sort of one of these animals that, well, I say it's rare, and once you start to notice them, you'll see them quite often. They're smaller than the shani, and they're a little bit shyer. And the way you tell them apart is dead simple. They just look like a bit like a regular shani, but they have this frilled tentacle on their head. They also have a sort of pattern of pale blue spots on their head and the rest of their body, so they're a little bit more colourful than the shani usually. And then there's Tompot blenny, which is an absolutely fantastic creature. They can get up to a foot long, but those you're very, very unlikely to ever see one of those rock pooling. Although apparently they're quite common to see when diving. But it is fairly likely that you'll eventually see some of the smaller sort of baby ones when you're rock pooling. And the thing to look out for with them is that they have a pair of fleshy tentacles on the head, whereas the Montague's blenny just has one. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for them. They're really lovable little creatures. Then we have the gobies. A lot of people seem to be kind of have a bit of confusion between the gobies and the blennies, but they are different animals or different groups of fish. The one you're most likely to see is the rock goby, which has very variable coloration. It's just a general sort of mottled combination of browns and greys. But the thing to look for is that they have a more flattened head than the blennies, and also they have, with the dorsal fin on the top of their body, gobies have two separate ones, whereas the shanies, or the blennies in general, although this isn't a great picture, they have one continuous dorsal fin, although it has a notch in the middle that can make it look like two. But if you look closely, yeah, blennies have one dorsal fin and gobies have two. One really awesome rockpool creature to look out for, although this is something that isn't that common, is the giant goby, which is a really impressive beast if you see one. I've seen one while rock pooling and one while snorkeling on Gili. And again, this is another animal which is a bit of a specialty of the southwest. Seems to be sort of prefer warmer water, so it's sort of increasing in number, and Cornwall's sort of like the first part of the country to get warmer seas, I guess. So it's just sort of appearing down here first, and they can get close to a foot long. They have a sort of something of a sort of salt and pepper coloration, and if you see an adult, it's pretty unmistakable just because of the size. There's no other rockpool fish that gets to that size that lives that high up the shoreline. But the juveniles could definitely be easily mistaken for a rock goby, and it's pretty hard to tell them apart. I probably wouldn't know, to be honest, without sort of scrutinising an ID book quite hard. And because they're actually quite a rarity, they're protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which means that unless you have a license, it's an offence to intentionally catch or disturb them. So if you do see one, definitely sort of leave the net alone and let it go about its business. Although good luck catching them, because the one I saw in a rock pool disappeared, like just vanished the moment I disturbed it. When I say disturbed, the moment I saw it, it saw me, and it vanished. So then we have the pipefish. The most likely one that you'll find is the worm pipefish, which is has this long, thin brown body, and if you look closely, it has this long snout. Same as a seahorse. They're in the same group as the seahorses. And similarly to the seahorses, it's the males that do the parenting. They don't have a pouch like the seahorses that the female puts the eggs into, but they do have a groove on the underside of the body that fills that the female will fill up with. Well, the males have a groove that the females will fill with eggs, and then the male will carry them around till they hatch. So at certain times of the year, I think it's in the springtime more. You can find males that have this row of orange eggs on the underside, and they're really, really easy to overlook. They look a lot like just a bit of debris, sort of like a bit of a twig or seaweed. There's actually 3 in this picture here, although you probably wouldn't know it just to look at it. But once you get your eye in with them, you can see them really easily. They're pretty common on Gili. I'd say after the shanies, they're probably the fish that I see most often. So yeah, they're just a really lovely little charming animal, definitely worth keeping an eye out for. On the other side of the spectrum, in terms of rarity, is the snake pipefish, which I have to admit you'd be very lucky to spot. I found one once, rock pooling earlier in the year, and I was a very happy boy that day. But it's definitely worth mentioning, just so you know what to look for in case you do come across one. They can get really big, so 60 centimeters, proper little sea serpent. They have sort of a yellow-brown body, which is sort of covered in all of these vertical pale blue lines, also pale grey lines. And they have a dark brownish red stripe running from the snout through the eye. And believe me, they just completely look like a piece of seaweed when they're in the water. They're real masters of disguise. So you need to sort of quite a lot of luck to spot them. But definitely keep your eyes peeled if you're sort of looking through seaweed. You'd only find one sort of quite far down the shore on a good low spring tide, probably. But yeah, keep an eye out for them because they're just absolutely fantastic animals if you are lucky enough to spot one. The long-spined sea scorpion, it can get up to 25 centimeters long, but like quite a few of these kind of rockpool creatures, the animals at their maximum size are generally sort of found further out, further out to sea. The ones you're likely to find in the rock pools are sort of more smaller juvenile ones, and they have really variable coloration. So coloration is no use as a sort of identifying feature, but they have a long cheek spine, which this isn't the best picture for showing, but they have a sort of large spine along the gill cover, and they can, if they're swallowed, they can inflate themselves and puff out these big long spines to sort of stick in the throat of whatever's tried to swallow them. They also have a small pair of these little barbels you can see at the corner of the mouth on either side. And they have a generally quite sort of stiff armored appearance that should help you to sort of identify them. They're called sea scorpions, but they aren't actually venomous, unlike lots of things like scorpionfish in tropical waters that are really venomous. And they're an ambush predator. So they'll use their camouflage and lay motionless until something comes by. They can actually change their color as well. So you can get them in any sort of number of sort of different shades of browns, whites, greens, sometimes sort of quite pretty pinks and reds as well. And unlike a lot of fish which bolt for cover the moment you go near the rock pool that they're in, these guys will probably just stay motionless for a lot longer until you sort of get right up close to them, and then they'll flee. And then we have this fantastic little beastie, the Cornish sucker, or the shore clingfish in other parts of the world is known. And it has a really weird sort of duck-billed face. And there's several other rarer types of clingfish that you're less likely to come across. The way that you know that you're looking at the shore clingfish is that it has this pair of blue spots behind the eyes. And they can be really, really faint, or they can be really distinctive. So you can see in this picture that they both of these have the blue spots, but one it's very vivid, and with the other it's quite faint, but they are there. If you really can't see any blue spots then on the clingfish that you found, then there's a potential that it might be, like I said, one of several rarer species, in which case you want to sort of break out the ID guides, I guess. And they're called clingfish or Cornish suckers because they have a really amazing ability to actually cling to rocks. They can use their pelvic fins, the fins on their underside, are modified into a sucker, and it's really, really strong. So if you find one, don't try and pull them off the rocks because it's such a strong grip they have that you can actually potentially damage them, hurt the little guys if you try and sort of just rip them off. So it's best to leave them be. But if you do manage to corral them into a tray or a bucket or something, be warned, they might not want to come out again. And because they're so sticky, it can be really hard to just actually get them out once you want to release them, if they decide they want to stay put. And if you're rock pooling in the spring, keep an eye out for them guarding a little patch of sort of yellowy golden eggs that they'll be sitting next to. That's a really cool thing to see. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for that. The butterfish or rock gunnel, it has a sort of long, slender eel-like body, generally a kind of red-brown coloration, and one of the sort of diagnostic features is this sort of a row of small black dots just along the base of the dorsal fin on the top of the body. 9 to 15, but generally it's 12, which is the best way of identifying them. And they also have really, really, really slippery skin, which is why they're called butterfish. And they're from they're a group of the family of fish that they belong to, which I can't remember the name of, is a bit of a sort of cold specialist group. So there's a chance that they'll sort of retract their range and get rare around these parts as climate change sort of continues. So it's not all good news, as I've been saying, with the seas getting warmer, all these lovely creatures like St. Piran's crabs and giant gobies potentially turning up and getting more common, but we might sort of eventually lose sort of some really nice creatures like the butterfish as well, which will sort of retract its range northwards, potentially. Then there's two types of these little fish called rocklings. There's the shore rockling and the five-bearded rockling. And the shore rockling has only 3 barbels on its face if you can get a good look. It can be quite hard because they really are, similarly to the butterfish, they're really slippery little guys. The five-bearded rockling has 5 barbels, hence the name. So yeah, they're a pretty cool little creature. They're actually a relative of the cod. And if you're ever able to get a really good look up close at them, the first ray of the dorsal fin, like you can see in this picture on the left here, that stands up, continuously kind of pulsates and beats in a sort of rhythmic motion that pulls fresh seawater over their face constantly, so as to bring in any currents that have any smell of food on them, so that their barbels can pick up, so that they can find their way to any meal potentially. So that's something to look out for if you can get a good close look at one. So with the wrasse, there's 2 main types that you'll probably find rock pooling, and the way that you can tell them from other fish that you're likely to find rock pooling is that they're free swimming. So with, I think, all the fish that I've mentioned so far, they generally sit around on the substrate or cling to rocks and things. But with wrasse, they're free swimming, and they have much more of a sort of classic fish shape, if you will. And they have quite a sort of leisurely, slow swimming style, although they can be really fast if you try and catch them. But if they're going about their business, they just sort of bob around in quite a sort of distinctive way once you've noticed them. And the two types you can get, there's the ballan wrasse, which is it's the biggest wrasse you'll find in UK waters. If you go snorkeling, you can see them, and there's loads on Kearley if you do go snorkeling. And the big males are actually spectacular. They're really beautiful animals, quite a lot of colours on them, and they can get to ½ a metre long. And the males can live the males can be up to 30 years old potentially. And they're also really weird because they all start out as females, and some of them will remain female their entire lives, but some of them will eventually become males and establish a territory. So they're what's called sequential hermaphrodites. And in terms of rock pooling, you're only really likely to find really small individuals. The big ones don't go sort of far enough inshore to be caught in rock pools at low tide, but yeah, the thing to look out for is a small fish less than 10 centimeters long that has this sort of bright emerald green color to it. And then there's the corkwing wrasse, which is probably the commonest wrasse in UK waters. They can get up to 15 centimeters long, and at all sort of life stages, they have this dark spot at the base of the tail. But the color can be really variable. It can be any sort of combination of a lot of sort of reds and browns and greens with attractive blue scales on sometimes. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for wrasse because they're just absolutely fantastic creatures. And then we've got the top knot, which is, I don't know, I have no idea why it's called a top knot. Don't know where it got that name from, but it's one of the only flatfish that's found in rocky habitats. Most flatfish prefer sort of sandy or sediment habitats that they can sort of bury themselves in. But these guys like rocks, they'll cling around to the underside of rocks a lot of the time. And they can get up to 25 centimeters, but generally you'll often find smaller individuals when you're rock pooling, like the one I showed at the beginning of the talk. Having said that, I typed this bit up before we went rock pooling last Sunday, where I did actually find a fully grown one, which was pretty cool. So like I said, you never know what you're going to find when you're rock pooling, and yeah, if you put in the hours, you can find some really weird stuff that is supposedly uncommon with a bit of luck. So yeah. So that's the end of this brief little kind of whistle-stop tour of some rockpool critters. So does anyone have any questions? I can see someone's typing. Okay. Okay, so I've got a question. Are there any creatures which would be dangerous for us to pick up, besides obviously getting nipped by a crab? That's a really good question. So there's rack my brains here. I mean, yeah, crabs are definitely the obvious thing. I mean, I guess if you're really, really lucky enough to find a lobster, I mean, those are a sort of top prize kind of rock pool find that's really quite uncommon. That would take fingers off if you were daft about it. But that, like I said, that's a pretty exceptional find. Sea urchins, I guess. The ones we get in this country aren't venomous, and they don't have very sort of big spiny spines. The commonest one is called the green sea urchin. I actually forgot to put it in the talk. That's not that spiny. You can pick it up, but I guess if you sort of squished it or put a lot of pressure on it, that would sort of, you'd end up with a load of spines in your hand. The spiny starfish, I guess it's sort of a little bit uncomfortable, but generally, I don't think there's a lot that's that dangerous to find when rock pooling. Definitely the velvet swimmer crab is the toughest customer there. There are actually, like I said, I didn't include any worms in the talk. There's a couple of things called ragworms and some of the bigger types. There's one called the king ragworm, which is, I've never found one, and they're quite sort of stunning iridescent color. But yeah, those have a really powerful bite on them. Apparently, they can give you quite a nasty nip. They're really predatory. So yeah, that would have to be my answer for that. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, I think that's if that's it for everyone, then thank you so much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and I hope it's just inspired you to get out and get rock pooling. I mean, we're really, really lucky that Gilly and Castle Beach are just they're just actually really, really excellent places to do rock pooling. I mean, Cornwall's full of fantastic beaches for it, but you don't have to get out in a car to see some really stunning animals. So yeah, thank you for coming.